The witching hour. In the dense forests of northern Maine, nestled deep within the thick foliage and ancient trees, lay the small, forgotten town of Raventon. With its population dwindling over the years and the creeping silence that enveloped it, Raventon seemed almost swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. Stories whispered through the generations spoke of strange happenings and eerie occurrences that plagued the town, but these were often dismissed as mere folklore. However, for those who lived there, the air was always thick with an unspoken fear, especially when the clock struck midnight, heralding the arrival of the witching hour. John Matthews, a journalist with an eye for uncovering hidden stories, arrived in Raventon late one October afternoon. He was drawn to the town by a series of disturbing reports that had piqued his curiosity. Disappearances, sightings of shadowy figures, and the unnerving silence that enveloped the town at night made it the perfect subject for his next big story. As he drove through the forest, the trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches like skeletal hands reaching out to grasp his car. The town itself was almost desolate. The few people he saw hurried along the streets, their faces etched with a mix of fear and resignation. John checked into the only inn in town, a decrepit building with peeling paint and a musty odor that spoke of years of neglect. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a haunted look in her eyes, handed him the key to his room without a word. John's room was small and sparsely furnished. As he unpacked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sense of unease grew as the sun began to set, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Determined to get to the bottom of the town's mysteries, he decided to explore Raventon and speak to its residents. The first person he approached was an old man sitting on a bench outside the inn. The man looked up as John approached, his eyes wary but curious. "Excuse me, sir," John began. "I'm a journalist, and I'm here to learn more about the strange occurrences in Raventon. Do you have any information you could share with me?" The old man chuckled, a sound that sent chills down John's spine. "Strange occurrences, you say? This town is full of them. But if you want to know the real story, you should talk to old Martha. She knows more about this place than anyone else." Intrigued, John asked for directions to Martha's house. The old man pointed him towards the outskirts of town, where a small, dilapidated cottage stood hidden among the trees. Thanking the man, John made his way to the cottage, the sense of dread growing with each step. Old Martha was known as the town's unofficial historian and its oldest resident. Her cottage, surrounded by overgrown shrubs and ancient oaks, looked like it had been plucked from another era. John knocked on the weathered door, and after a few moments, it creaked open to reveal a frail, hunched woman with piercing blue eyes. "Who are you, and what do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp and commanding despite her age. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is John Matthews. I'm a journalist, and I've come to learn about the strange happenings in Raventon." The old man at the inn suggested I speak with you. Martha's eyes narrowed, and she seemed to study John for a long moment before stepping aside to let him in. The interior of the cottage was cluttered with books, old photographs, and various trinkets, each with a story of its own. "Sit," Martha ordered, gesturing to a worn chair by the fireplace. John obeyed, sensing that this woman commanded respect. "You want to know about the witching hour, don't you?" she asked, her voice lowering to a whisper. John nodded, leaning forward in his chair. "Yes, I do. What can you tell me?" Martha sighed, settling into her own chair with a groan. "The witching hour is not just a myth, Mr. Matthews. It is a time when the boundary between our world and the supernatural is thinnest. In Raventon, this is particularly true. The town was built on cursed land, a place where dark forces have always held sway. She paused, her eyes distant as if recalling a painful memory. It all began centuries ago, with the arrival of a woman named Eliza Blackwood. She was a healer, but the townsfolk called her a witch. When crops failed and children fell ill, they blamed her. In their fear and ignorance, they decided to rid themselves of her. John listened, captivated by the story. What happened to her? They captured her and burned her at the stake, Martha said, her voice tinged with sorrow. But before she died, Eliza cursed the town. She vowed that her spirit would never rest and that those who wronged her would suffer. Ever since, strange things have happened in Raventon, especially during the witching hour. Martha's tale left John with more questions than answers. "Do you believe the curse is real?" he asked. Martha looked him square in the eye. "I do. I've seen things, heard things that cannot be explained, and I fear that the worst is yet to come." As darkness fell over Raventon, John couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He returned to his room at the inn, his mind racing with the stories he had heard. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and casting eerie shadows on the walls. Determined to document his experiences, John set up his camera and audio recorder, hoping to capture any evidence of the supernatural. As the clock neared midnight, the atmosphere grew heavier, and the silence became almost deafening. At the stroke of midnight, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the hairs on the back of John's neck stood on end. He glanced at his equipment, noting that the camera was recording. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the small candle he had lit. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the window. John's heart raced as he felt a presence in the room. The floorboards creaked, and he heard a faint whispering, though he couldn't make out the words. Gathering his courage, he called out, "Is anyone there?" The whispering ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. John held his breath, straining to hear any sound. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow move across the room. He turned, but there was nothing there. Before he could react, a chilling voice whispered directly into his ear, "Leave this place." John jumped, his pulse pounding in his ears. He fumbled for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. There was no one there, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. He checked his camera and recorder, hoping they had captured something, anything, to prove he wasn't losing his mind. Exhausted and shaken, John finally fell into a restless sleep, the events of the night replaying in his mind. When he awoke the next morning, he reviewed the footage and audio. To his astonishment, the camera had captured the shadow moving across the room, and the recorder had picked up the chilling whisper. Determined to find out more, John decided to visit the town's library, hoping to uncover more about Eliza Blackwood and the curse that plagued Raventon. The Raventon Library was a small, dusty building, filled with the scent of old books and aged wood. It seemed like a relic from another time, much like the rest of the town. The librarian, a bespectacled woman named Miss Hargrove, greeted John with a polite but cautious smile. "Good morning," John began. "I'm researching the history of Raventon, particularly anything related to Eliza Blackwood and the supposed curse. Can you help me?" Ms. Hargrove's expression darkened at the mention of Eliza's name. "Ah, Eliza Blackwood. Not many people like to talk about her. But we do have some old records and books that might be of interest to you." She led John to a section of the library filled with ancient tomes and dusty files. "These documents cover the early history of Raventon. You might find what you're looking for here." John thanked her and began his search. Hours passed as he sifted through old newspapers, journals, and books. Finally, he came across a worn leather-bound journal that belonged to a man named Samuel Whitaker, one of the town's founders. The journal detailed the events leading up to Eliza Blackwood's execution. It painted a vivid picture of a town gripped by fear and paranoia. Crops had failed, and a mysterious illness had swept through the children of Raventon. The townsfolk, desperate for someone to blame, turned their wrath on Eliza, the local healer. Samuel's journal revealed that Eliza had indeed cursed the town with her dying breath. "You will all suffer as I have suffered. Your children will know my pain, and your nights will be filled with terror," she had proclaimed. John shivered as he read the words, the weight of the curse seeming to seep from the pages. As he continued reading, he found accounts of strange occurrences that had plagued the town ever since. Sightings of shadowy figures, unexplained disappearances, and the chilling presence that seemed to permeate the air at night. One entry caught John's eye. It spoke of a ritual that the townsfolk had performed in a desperate attempt to lift the curse. They had sought the help of a mysterious outsider, a man who claimed to have knowledge of the occult. The ritual involved a series of symbols and incantations, but it had gone horribly wrong, resulting in the deaths of several participants. John's mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps this failed ritual had somehow strengthened the curse, binding it more tightly to the town. He copied the details of the ritual, hoping it might provide a clue to understanding the witching hour and finding a way to break the curse. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town, John knew he had to dig deeper into the failed ritual. He needed to understand the symbols and incantations used, hoping they might offer a way to lift the curse or at least provide some protection during the witching hour. He returned to old Martha's cottage, clutching the copied details of the ritual. Martha answered the door with a knowing look, as if she had been expecting him. "I found something in the library," John said, showing her the pages. "A ritual that was performed to lift the curse. It went wrong, but maybe there's something here that can help us." Martha studied the pages, her eyes narrowing. "This ritual. I remember hearing about it. My grandmother spoke of it in hushed tones. The symbols, the incantations, they were meant to banish evil, but something went awry. The participants didn't understand the forces they were dealing with." She pointed to a series of symbols drawn on the page. "These are protective sigils. They need to be drawn perfectly, and the incantations must be spoken with absolute precision. One mistake, and you could invite more darkness." John felt a mix of hope and trepidation. "Do you think we can perform it correctly? Is there any way to reverse the damage done?" Martha sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I don't know. But if we are to try, we must be prepared. The witching hour is when the veil between worlds is thinnest. We must be vigilant and strong-willed." Together, they gathered the necessary materials: chalk for drawing the sigils, candles to provide light, and a copy of the incantations. As midnight approached, they prepared the ritual space in Martha's cottage, the air thick with anticipation and fear. As the clock struck midnight, John and Martha stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the protective sigils they had painstakingly drawn. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. John felt a chill run down his spine as the temperature dropped, and the oppressive silence of the witching hour enveloped them. Martha began to chant the incantations, her voice steady and firm. John followed her lead, his own voice trembling slightly. The air grew heavy, and an unnatural darkness seemed to seep into the room, pressing down on them. As they continued the ritual, John saw movement in the shadows. Figures, indistinct and ghostly, seemed to flit around the edges of the room, watching them with malevolent intent. He forced himself to focus on the incantations, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, a fierce wind whipped through the room, extinguishing the candles. The darkness became absolute, and John felt a cold hand brush against his face. He gasped, nearly losing his place in the chant. "Stay focused," Martha commanded, her voice cutting through the darkness. "Do not break the circle." John steeled himself, continuing to recite the incantations. The wind howled, and the shadows seemed to grow more solid, pressing in on them. Just as he felt he could bear it no longer, there was a blinding flash of light, and the oppressive darkness lifted. The room was still, the candles miraculously relit. John and Martha stood in silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sigils on the floor glowed faintly, a sign that their protective power had been activated. "Did it work?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Martha shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know, but we have done what we can. Only time will tell if we have weakened the curse or provoked it further." The following days were tense. The townspeople, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, were on edge. John continued his investigations, speaking with anyone who would talk to him, documenting their experiences and fears. The sense of foreboding never entirely left him, especially as the witching hour approached each night. One evening, as John reviewed his notes in his room, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find a young woman standing there, her eyes wide with fear. "Are you John Matthews?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" She stepped inside, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "My name is Emily. I need to talk to you about the curse. There's something you need to know." John gestured for her to sit, offering her a glass of water. "What is it, Emily?" She took a deep breath, clutching the glass tightly. "My family has been in Raventon for generations. My grandmother used to tell me stories about Eliza Blackwood. She believed that the curse wasn't just about vengeance. Eliza wanted something specific." John leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What did she want?" "She wanted to find her lost child," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eliza had a daughter, but the townsfolk took her away, believing she was a witch as well. They hid the child, and Eliza was desperate to find her. The curse was her way of ensuring that no one would rest until her daughter was found." John's mind raced with this new information. "Do you know where the child was hidden?" Emily shook her head. "No one does. The secret was buried with those who took her. But my grandmother believed that Eliza's spirit would reveal the truth to someone worthy, someone who truly wanted to end the curse." Determined to uncover the truth, John decided to search for any clues that might lead to Eliza's lost child. He scoured the town, speaking with the oldest residents, digging through old records, and following any leads, no matter how tenuous. John's search led him to the outskirts of Raventon, to an old, abandoned house that had once belonged to the town's mayor. The house was dilapidated, its windows boarded up, and its walls covered in ivy. According to the town's records, this was where the mayor had lived during the time of Eliza Blackwood's execution. Breaking into the house was easier than John had anticipated. The door creaked open with a push, and he stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under his weight. He explored the house room by room, looking for anything that might hint at the whereabouts of Eliza's daughter. In the attic, he found a chest covered in cobwebs. Inside, he discovered a collection of old letters and a diary that belonged to the mayor's wife. The diary entries were heartbreaking. They detailed the mayor's involvement in taking Eliza's daughter and hiding her away. The mayor's wife had been conflicted, believing that the child was innocent and should not be punished for her mother's supposed crimes. The final entry revealed that the child had been hidden in a secret room in the basement of the house. John hurried to the basement, his heart pounding. He searched the walls, tapping them until he found a hollow section. Pushing against it, he discovered a hidden door that creaked open to reveal a small, dark room. Inside the room, he found a crib and a few children's toys, covered in dust and untouched for centuries. There was also a small, tattered blanket embroidered with the name Lydia. John felt a pang of sorrow, realizing that this was Eliza's lost child. As he stood there, the temperature in the room dropped, and he felt a presence behind him. Turning slowly, he saw the ghostly figure of a woman, her eyes filled with sorrow and longing. "Eliza," John whispered, his voice shaking. The ghost nodded, her gaze fixed on the crib. "My Lydia," she said, her voice a soft, mournful whisper. "Thank you for finding her." John felt a surge of compassion. "Eliza, is there a way to end the curse, to give you peace?" Eliza's ghost looked at him, her expression softening. "Bring her remains to me. Lay her to rest beside me, and the curse will be lifted." Determined to fulfill Eliza's request, John gathered the remains of Lydia, which he found in a small box beneath the crib. He carefully wrapped them in the blanket and left the house, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. John returned to old Martha's cottage, explaining what he had found in Eliza's request. Martha nodded, her eyes filled with both hope and sadness. "We must take her remains to the place where Eliza was executed," Martha said. "There is a small cemetery there, where she was buried in an unmarked grave." That night, John and Martha made their way to the cemetery, carrying Lydia's remains. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the gravestones. They found Eliza's grave, marked by a simple stone that bore no name. As they laid Lydia's remains beside her mother's grave, a sense of calm settled over the cemetery. The wind stilled, and the oppressive darkness that had plagued Raventon seemed to lift. Eliza's ghost appeared before them, her expression one of gratitude and peace. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have given me what I have longed for. My child is finally with me." As Eliza's ghost faded, John felt a profound sense of relief. The curse that had haunted Raventon for centuries was finally lifted. The town would no longer be plagued by the witching hour, and its residents could finally know peace. In the days that followed, Raventon seemed to awaken from a long nightmare. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the townspeople began to rebuild their lives. The strange occurrences ceased, and the witching hour became just another part of the night, no longer a time of fear and dread. John documented the entire experience, his article bringing both attention and understanding to the plight of Raventon. His story was not just one of supernatural occurrences, but also of human resilience and the power of uncovering the truth. As he prepared to leave Raventon, John visited old Martha one last time. They sat together on her porch, watching the sunset over the forest. "You did a good thing, John," Martha said, her voice filled with warmth. "You brought peace to this town and gave Eliza the closure she needed." John smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment. "I couldn't have done it without you, Martha. Thank you for your help." Martha patted his hand. "Take care, John, and remember, not all stories are meant to be uncovered. Some mysteries are best left alone." With those words in mind, John left Raventon, carrying with him the lessons he had learned. The witching hour had tested his courage and resolve, but it had also shown him the strength of the human spirit. And as he drove away from the town that had once been shrouded in darkness, he felt a newfound appreciation for the light